Hi everybody, and here we are again. It's good to see you. All right, so in our book, again, our wonderful book, you need to look at and highlight things that are beginning on page 546 all the way to 570. And 570 ends with, yes, the progressive presidents. So we'll be talking about them next time. All right, but so those are the things you need to organize those pages, because it is open book, right? Because, I mean, you don't need to take notes on the book because you have the book. Yay. Okay, so I asked you, or I warned you, or I told you, or whatever, last time that I wanted you to be aware that we want to look at this this image of a painting that's right here. And this painting is by an artist named John Sloan. And it's called 6th Avenue and 13th Street, and it was done in 1907. And this is a street in New York City. And the reason, I think the author of the book did a great job in choosing this to talk about what is chapter 18, which is the progressive era, because it shows us what everyday life was like in New York City at the beginning of the 20th century. And so we have this section of New York City, and you have all these people mixing and walking around the city, and you have a working class lady there dressed in white, and she's carrying looks like a pail, which is like a lunch pail. That's how people would actually carry their lunches. They would make them and put them in these containers. And then you have these two ladies walking there that are dressed up, kind of like oddly dressed up for the middle of the day, which could suggest that these ladies were looking for work, if you get my drift. This is not an elegant part of the city. This is just like the nitty-gritty city, apart from the area where the wealthy live. And we've talked about the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers. They're living, well, the Rockefellers aren't, but they're living in another city. But the Vanderbilts, they're living on Park Avenue and these mansions, and everything is just picture perfect. Well, most people are not living like that. And you'll even notice if you look at this painting closer up, there's some newspaper in the street, so it's it's not spotless and clean and everything. And this is the reason rather for what comes to be termed as the progressive era. It's where the politicians and private groups, some of them wives of the wealthy, start looking at conditions in especially the urban areas and saying there needs to be something done. There needs to be something to create safer workplaces, better conditions for living, and so forth. Now, we had talked earlier about the whole idea of social Darwinism and how this really gave these wealthy industrialists kind of like off the hook. Because you were born poor, that's how you are, and we can't make you more wealthy, or you can't work your way up because you're really not mentally ready to be a leader because you were born poor, and that's a whole different type of mentality, which is total, not true. So that it kind of helped assuage the conscience of these industrialists. But as things started to, as the city started to grow and more things started to occur, there was just a point you couldn't ignore some of the problems that were going on. And your book starts with a discussion of a tragic event. And this was a brilliant way to start this chapter because it gives you a very good idea of not just what happened at this one factory, but things similar to this were happening all over in all of the metropolitan large urban areas in the United States. This particular event happened in 1911, and it happened in New York City, and it's all talked about on page 547, as I said. And what happened is that you had women working in a place called the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. And so, okay, what is a shirtwaist, right? All right, we don't call them shirtwaists. We call these items of clothing that these women were making blouses. And so they would have these long skirts, and then they would have these blouses, and they were usually very high collar, long sleeves. Sometimes they had these really balloony kind of sleeves at the top and then tight on the rest of the arm. And they made these because they were in high demand. And so Triangle was the name chosen, and then shirtwaist. There were lots of shirtwaist companies and factories in the urban areas, particularly in New York City. And this building that this company was in was a very tall building for the time, 10 stories tall. And there were around 500 workers. Now, most of the workers there were, as your book states, young Jewish and Italian immigrant women. And the reason why they were usually immigrant women is because the owners paid them less than they would have otherwise. And so they sat at sewing machines and they made these shirtwaists. Now, how they would work that is like, one person would make this, do the same thing on the sleeves, and the next person would do the collar, and the next person, so it was very monotonous, and they just really worked nonstop on these shirtwaists, because the more they made, of course, the more money that the company can make. Well, they complained, and the women complained, and they actually had a strike prior to this, and they said that the working conditions were dangerous, and they were, not being treated fairly, and so they went out on strike. I mean, it wasn't just the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, it was shirtwaist companies all around the city, and they were out for several months. And some of the shirtwaist companies, the owners said, okay, we hear what you're saying, and so they tried to improve conditions, and some of them even improved their wages. Not the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. And after so long, and some of the companies had, made progress, so that the women had made progress in getting some better conditions and, better wages. Well, then you just had like the Triangle girls hanging out, and nothing was changing. So they went back to work. And it's so sad because under a year later, a fire breaks out. And it happened on March 25th, 1911. And it was horrific. There was, of course, fabric all over the place. The fire started, that's questionable how the fire started, because the investigation wasn't that good. It's said that somebody was smoking in an area they shouldn't have been, and then that caught, fabric on fire, and then that progressed through the building. Of course, at this time there were no sprinkler systems or anything like that. No fire extinguishers. And And also, when you're dealing with, they were dealing with thread, you know, and cotton thread, and I mean, lots and lots of spools of this, and there would be little bits of it that flew through the air, and the women talked about that, you know, how they were breathing in all of this, you know, lint, basically, and that became combustible in this event. So, I mean, fires were just, you know, there was the main fire, and then there were just fires, it was just engulfing the building. And the fire department of the day got there, but they could only get to the 6th floor. So all the people trapped above the 6th floor, there were no ladders that could reach them. And so you had women jumping out of the upper stories. And there were 46 women and some men who either jumped out, or one of the real tragedies was there were fire escapes, which we don't really have them in modern buildings today, but they're stairwells, and they're made of metal, and they were outside of the buildings, placed outside of buildings. And so you would go out like through a window and you go to the fire escape. If you've been to New York, you've probably seen these types of things. And then you would let down the next level, and you could go, then you could exit the building via, and they were known as fire escapes. Well, so people started trying to get to the fire escapes, and there were so many of them that, of course, there was no kind of code at this time. And so they got out on there, and there was too many of them, and it actually, fell. The fire escapes fell. So some people of those 46 were on a fire escape, but it fell with them. And of course, all of these people were killed. And then there were 100 people that never made it out of the building. Terrible tragedy happening in the middle of the day. So people were seeing it. People were witnessing it. The owners were charged with negligence. But then they basically got off. There was only one exit outside, and it was in the front, and that quickly became inaccessible. There was an exit for the back, which they were supposed to provide, but they had locked it from the outside, because they said that women were stealing threads and needles and stuff like that. So when they tried to get out, the exit out the back, no way. They had locked it. Unbelievable situation where these owners put them in such dangerous conditions. And by the way, they were up, and they learned of the fire, and they were able to get out with no problem. Okay. They got out, and they were brought up on charges, but they got off. And so what did they do? They bought another building not far from where the Triangle building had been, and they did another shirtwaist company, and, whatever. Horrifying. Absolutely horrifying. And so this really brought attention to the fact that there are people working in conditions that are deadly conditions, not just uncomfortable. And so you have people starting to see, okay, things need to be made better. And so we call this the progressive era. So we're progressing towards a better way to organize our society and to provide for society. And so we start to have people looking into it, and we start to have women are a big part of this, and start setting up foundations and places for women that are experiencing abuse in the home, or or husbands, there's a lot of problem with drinking at this time. And of course, this will fuel the whole prohibition idea, because men are drinking and they are not bringing money home. And then when they are coming home, they might or might not have money, but then they're behaving badly because they're alcoholics. So there's women's groups that are addressing this. And so this is the time when we start to see the social services industry be born. And so this is a very, very important time. Was everything done that needed to get done? No. There's still stuff that needs to get done that hasn't been done, or is not done as much as it needs to be. So you're going to read a lot about that. And this is also when we have more and more working class people who are working in jobs 9 to 5, so they have weekends off, many of them. And so there is entertainment. They want to go do things. So we start to have moving pictures. And so people go and they go see these early films, these early silent films. And then people want to buy stuff because they've been working hard all week and they want to buy stuff. Consumer society. It didn't start during this. It started earlier in the mid to late 1800s, but it certainly carries on. And now we have people that are making wages, and so they have, they can set aside certain amounts of their income so that they can do, different things, entertainment, or they can buy things that are being made in all these factories, right? Okay. And one of the things that's being made are cars. And Henry Ford. We mentioned Henry Ford, I believe, but regardless, I know it's been a while since we've been together. So we have Henry Ford, and this is talked about on page 553. And this is a huge event that happens because in 1905, Henry Ford establishes the Ford Motor Company. And he's not the only one to start a car company making cars, but he's the one that's the most famous. And he's the one who takes the idea of the assembly line and perfects it. So does he invent the assembly line? No, but he perfects it so that he can create all these cars, so many cars a day. In 1913, his factory in Highland Park, Michigan, started the moving assembly line. So this is something that was new that he started, because the assembly line work was being done, but it wasn't like on a moving a type of moving counter or floor or anything like that. So he had it moving, so a car would start and you'd have certain people that did a certain part of the beginning of the car, and then the next it would move down the line, the car would move down the line, then you have next people doing that, and it moved slow enough so that these people each did their job, and then you ended up with the final car. And so it made it much more economical to do, and so he could sell these cars for much less than a factory where you had just one, or not one, but a group of people who were working on one car that cost more than it did if you had this assembly line type idea. And he did. He was able to by 1910, 730,000 Model Ts were made, and they sold at a price of $316. And that was in that price was in 1916. So he's making hundreds of thousands of cars a year, and he's pricing them at $316, which that was a lot of money then, but it wasn't beyond what a working class person could save up for. And they did. And so more and more and more and more people had cars. And of course, that changed society in immeasurable ways because we became mobile for the first time. and being able to get places faster and, you know, relatively economically, you know, because you didn't have to feed a car. I mean, yes, you had to put gas in the car, but you didn't have to feed it like you did with a horse and water it and all that good stuff. So that is a huge, huge event that occurred during these early years of the 1900s that has followed us through till today, because we are very much a consumer society and we are very much of a mobile society. Well, you know, particularly we always have been. Right now we are a shut-in society. But, you know, we'll get back to normal here sometime. And, you know, people have their cars and they're very important. People can't imagine not having their cars. The only, if you have a large urban place like New York City, Chicago, they have a lot of mass transit, which is the whole idea on the combustion engine and, you know, having mobile transportation. But in the rest of the country, you know, we've got our cars and we all expect to have cars, and that's how we conduct our daily lives. So those are two very, very important things to note. And so you will go all this information to page 570. And so do take note of the 17th Amendment on page 565. So be sure you read. In general, anything that is bold, you want to be sure that you know, highlight that, because there's a good chance that could be on the exam. Not the only things, but those things particularly. And so then on next time I see you, we will begin on page 570 with the progressive presidents and how the presidents handle this society that really gets going in the late teens and then the early 20s. So anyway, that's what we are doing for this week, and I hope you have a good and healthy and safe week, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.